Hello everyone, it's Dylan from Yugioh Everything, and welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh! VRains episode review. This time we will be going over episode 65 of Yu-Gi-Oh! VRains, the second part to the meeting and how the origins of Playmaker really came about. The meeting between Kusanagi and Playmaker, or back then they were both known as Unnamed and Unknown. So we are going to get into the review, my general impressions, and hopefully you guys will leave your thoughts on the episode down below. My general impressions is that I really liked this episode a lot. I really did enjoy it. It was one of the better episodes, the better, I feel like, world-building episodes in a while. And it's, of course, always great to have questions that you've been wondering for about a year now finally answered, and we finally learned how Kusanagi and Yusaku met. We learned that in the last episode, and in this episode it was all about their bonds continuing to grow stronger and their connection with each other continuing to go stronger, but most importantly, we learned how Playmaker came into contact with the Cyberse deck, which was a question that we had kind of been wondering since the second episode, right? Because Playmaker had these Cyberse cards, and I believe Akira was very surprised by it. The Knights of Hanoi were very surprised by it, so we were all like, well, how did he even get this deck? Did he just always have this deck? And the answer is given to us in this episode. So that was really, really awesome. Really great episode from that perspective. There was one thing that I didn't really love, and I guess I'll start with that. The whole concept of death in Yu-Gi-Oh! VRains has been very all over the place, I feel like. I don't even want to say ambiguous. It's just been very all over the place. On the very second episode in the first duel, I said to Playmaker that if we take really bad fall damage, we'll die in real life. And we've seen some really bad damage before. We've seen Gnome in his duel against Go fall very harshly into the ground. We've seen, I believe it was Blue Angel thrown through a building in her duel against Vira, I want to say. I think we've also seen Playmaker kind of crash into a building before. Like, we've seen some really intense pain in the VR world that has not necessarily translated to real-life damage. So it's been very kind of wish-washy in that regard, but even in this episode, I feel like there was contradiction in this episode regarding death. There was one trap that they immediately almost fell into that actually Kusanagi would have fallen into if Playmaker didn't notice it, take a step back, and grab Kusanagi's arm and save him. And at the bottom of this pit, we see, you could probably see it on screen, all these duel discs that have these very sharp spikes through them, and obviously it's supposed to represent like Indiana Jones, and even Kusanagi makes a reference that whoever designed this dungeon must have been watching too many adventure movies, because it really is a whole Indiana Jones reference. At least that's the vibe that I got from it. And instead of seeing, corpses at the bottom of this pit, because that would have been a little too intense, or skeletons, we see duel discs. But Playmaker says that if you fall, you wouldn't have been logged out because you need your duel disc to log out. So Playmaker right there is implying that had Kusanagi fallen, he probably would not have been able to log out, but we don't see any corpses or bodies or VR accounts at the bottom of this pit, so we're assuming that everyone who fell into this pit was logged out. And even though Playmaker literally just said that if your duel disk is unable to function and you can't log out through your duel disk, then you're stuck in the VR world. But we don't see anyone stuck at the bottom of the pit, even though we see dozens of broken duel discs. So that was something that I don't even think I misinterpreted it. I think it was just very ambiguous. I was going to say very not clear, but it's very ambiguous the way they leave it, where they kind of want to make the viewer believe that there are really high stakes, and they do a decent job at it, but then there's moments like when the Knight of Hanoi is dueling the Ancient Ghost, and he falls into the trap of attacking. The Ancient Ghost uses a Chaos Burst, I believe that was the trap card, takes 1,000 points of damage, and this nightmare-fueled worm that looked like a much bigger version of Playmaker's eye ends up eating the Knight of Hanoi, which is definitely, and you can even see the Knight, like, his arms, it was pretty grotesque, and the Knight is then forcibly logged out, but we see his duel disc fall into the pit and go through, I believe, the spike. I believe that's the moment when the duel disc, we saw the duel disc go through one of the needles, and Playmaker or Kusanagi says, wow, I've never seen someone forcibly logged out like that. Even though Playmaker just made it clear about 5 minutes ago that if your duel disc is rendered useless, or you can't log out through your duel disk, then you're stuck in Link VRains and you're unable to log out. But then he was just forcibly logged out by this worm. So that's the one thing about this episode, and the one thing about VRains that has always been very wish-washy to me. The whole concept of death, where they want you to believe that there are stakes, they want you to believe that damage in the VR world will equal damage in the real-life world, and even though, saying it is one thing, doing it is another, and I feel like they have not shown that well at all to this point, and I feel like that's the one concept of this show that has always been a little iffy, but for me it doesn't really negate the show's value in any way. I still love the show, I enjoy the show, I just wish they kind of handled that element a little better. But anyway, Playmaker takes on the Ancient Ghost. The Ancient Ghost doesn't say a word. I was waiting for him to speak or say something like really creepy, but it didn't happen. He's probably just a hologram, honestly, or just an Ancient Ghost who's unable to speak. And Playmaker ends up using this really good combo where it all had to be effect damage. He learned that by watching the Knight of Hanoi. He knew if he attacked, Ancient Ghost would be able to use Chaos Burst. So Playmaker uses one card that for every monster sent to the grave, you deal 300 points of damage, and then for every monster resurrected, you deal another 500 points of damage. So he had to have 5 monsters on the field to use this combo to be 1,500 and 2,500 to get all of the Ancient Ghost's attack points down to, or life points, down from 4,000 to 0. And luckily, Playmaker has made a living in this show hitting OTKs. Someone listed out all of his OTKs, one-turn kills, and I believe in 40 or 45% of his duels, he has literally won via the one-turn kill, which I'm sure is way, way higher than any Yu-Gi-Oh protagonist, probably any Yu-Gi-Oh character even. So, Playmaker used to this style of dueling, and maybe he's so used to the one-turn kill because this is the duel that really created Playmaker. This is the duel that gave Playmaker his Cyberse deck, and so maybe every time he hits a one-turn kill, he kind of remembers this moment. I don't know, I'm just trying to, give him an excuse for, or maybe give the writers an excuse for so many OTKs. But anyway, Playmaker wins. They cross the bridge. There's nothing there. There was a great moment where another Knight of Hanoi comes and Kusanagi tackles the Knight of Hanoi and handcuffs him temporarily to the wall so that Playmaker can finish the duel. Really awesome moment for Kusanagi. Again, just the symbolism there. Playmaker being the sword dueling against the ghost, where Kusanagi is being the shield defending Playmaker. So I really, really did enjoy that. And another moment that I loved is when Kusanagi was trying to help Playmaker out with the dueling, and at one point, Playmaker says something very complicated, and Kusanagi says exactly what I always think during a lot of these moments, where he's just like, oh, this is way too complicated for me. So I'm just glad that there is a character in this universe who is recognizing himself that he is not a good duelist, that this stuff is way over his head. And there's a lot of people who I think watch the anime, definitely way more people that watch the anime than play the card game, that don't really have an amazing sense of grasp on all the rules and all the strategy and all the thought process that goes into it. So I'm glad that the writers kind of recognize that not everyone who watches the anime is an amazing TCG, OCG player, and it just let me relate to Kusanagi so much more, and probably anyone who doesn't play the game probably can just relate to that line extremely, extremely well. So they get to the sarcophagus that the Cyberse deck is supposed to be held in. There is no Cyberse deck in the sarcophagus, but Playmaker quickly realizes that the pillars from the Link summoning during his duel against the Ancient Ghost was a map, and it brings them in the real world to a warehouse where they find the same exact sarcophagus. Playmaker gets the Cyberse deck, and then a very interesting moment happens where Kusanagi says, as long as you have this deck will symbolize the eternal bond between us, and they kind of do like a high five. And I wonder if that is a foreshadowing based on what we know from the second opening as well, where Kusanagi and Playmaker kind of have that standoff scene. Maybe Playmaker is going to lose the Cyberse deck. Maybe at one point Playmaker is going to lose his Ignis, and because of that, the Ignis Eye is going to take the Cyberse deck with him. And because of that, that will sever the relationship between Playmaker and Kusanagi. Just keep an eye on that, because if that is what happens, then the foreshadowing in this episode is incredible. Of course, you never really know if something is foreshadowing. We can't fast forward into the future and know what's going to happen in this show, but I just thought that was very interesting, especially given the small hint that we have in opening 2 about a potential standoff between these two seemingly best friends. So that is a really, really interesting thing to keep an eye on. But yeah, this episode was great. Another thing that I felt they could have explained a little better was how Playmaker did get his name, because we see Ignis, we see we see Flame, we see Soulburner or Homura in Kusanagi's truck, and they ask, well, you still didn't get to the part about Playmaker's origin and how Playmaker, came to be. And Kusanagi smiles, and we see a Knight of Hanoi running, and then he looks up, and it's an awesome, badass shot, and he looks up and he sees Yusaku, he sees Playmaker, and he goes, who are you? And Playmaker goes, my name is Playmaker, I'm the envoy of revenge, the same line he used against Revolver, that will take down the Knights of Hanoi. But we don't really know, why he chose the name Playmaker, how he, got to the name Playmaker. I feel like we don't have to know, but I feel like it would have also been cool at the same time to at least have some sort of understanding why he chose Playmaker, why that name was special to him. So that was something that I felt like they maybe could have touched on a little more. They maybe could have gone a little more in depth on. They obviously didn't have to. I still think it works. It's his name. It's the name he chose. The reason he chose that name, again, we may never know, and I guess that's the part that I feel they could have done a little better on. But still, it was an awesome, badass scene of him, almost harassing the Knights of Hanoi the same way that they harassed Kusanagi, the same way that they harassed pretty much Naoki. They harass everyone because they're just trying to learn about the Cyberse deck and get their hands on the Cyberse. So really cool to see the tables twist at the very end of this episode. But yeah, it was a really good episode. We've learned a lot in these last 2 episodes between how Playmaker got in touch with the Cyberse deck, his motivation to get the Cyberse deck, how Yusaku and Kusanagi came into contact with each other. We heard Jin speak in episode 64, even though it wasn't really present day, but that was an awesome moment. And there was a lot of potential foreshadowing where Kusanagi says, I can envision my brother growing as strong as you. Maybe that's a foreshadowing that Jin will duel Playmaker or Yusaku at some point in the future and maybe defeat him because he will finally live up to the potential that Kusanagi sees in him. Maybe this is a foreshadowing in episode 65 where, as long as we have this deck, our bond will stay eternal, that Playmaker will lose the deck at some point and that will cause a rift for whatever reason in the relationship between him and Kusanagi. There was a lot to digest and to kind of analyze in these episodes, and I really did like that. So I hope you guys enjoyed my review. Please leave all your thoughts down below. A special thank you to my Platinum tier patrons, Alexa Baker, Christopher Johannes Bouska, Glen McGookin, Jorge Carrillo, and James Rose, and to my Diamond tier patron, Soledsnak and bouldergeist, and of course, to my Egyptian God tier patron, Syn Cloud. Cannot thank you all enough who support me over on Patreon. It helps me out immensely, and thank you all at home for watching my videos as well. I will talk to you guys down below in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an amazing day.